Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Lunch and Learn series. My name is Giza Lopez, and I am the Executive Director of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. On behalf of the YJI, I am very, very happy to welcome each of you to this month's webinar. I'm going to go off script here for a second and ask you to help us celebrate a milestone. We just realized a few minutes before we started here that this is our 30th webinar since March 2020. So I would like to give a shout out to the YJI team for making these happen. Thank you. Thank you to all of you for joining us today and for making time to learn more about youth justice research. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. If this is not your first Lunch and Learn, welcome back. If it is your first, welcome, and you can see pretty much all of the other 29 webinars in our playlist on our YouTube channel. Somebody's going to share that with you in chat in a minute. I also would like to express my thanks to our partners in New York State, the Division of Criminal Justice Services, the Office of Children and Family Services, the University at Albany, and the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group. Without their support, we wouldn't be here. So thank you. Today, it is our pleasure to host Blane Skiles. Blane is the Communications Director for the Deason Criminal Justice Reform Center at SMU Dedman School of Law in Dallas. If we're lucky, we're also going to be graced with the presence of a guest speaker, Lucy, a lovely corgi that may be in the background there joining Blane. Blane, it is wonderful to have you with us today. We're looking forward very much to getting better at report writing and research translation. And to moderate the Q&A and to properly introduce Mr. Skiles, I'm going to now invite to the screen Alicia Gagnon, who is our Research and Evaluation Specialist here at the YJI. Alicia, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Giza. And hello, everybody, and welcome to the Youth Justice Institute's Lunch and Learn webinar series. My name, as Giza noted, is Alicia Gagnon, and I am the Research and Evaluation Specialist at the YJI. Today, we bring to you some cutting-edge research on juvenile justice issues in what we hope is an engaging and thought-provoking format. Today's topic, Writing Reports Everyone Wants to Read, is presented by Blane Skiles, the Communications Director for the Deason Criminal Justice Reform Center at SMU Dedman School of Law in Dallas. Before joining the Deason Center, Blane was a journalist. Most recently, he worked for NBC as a producer, helping to launch a new national TV network. In addition to his experience producing live television, Blane has produced and directed 2 documentary films. His work has been recognized with 2 Emmy Awards, as well as honors from the Associated Press and the prestigious National Edward R. Murrow Award. His presentation today is titled Research for Reform: How to Craft Reports That Make an Impact. So without further ado, Blane, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm really grateful to the YJI for hosting this webinar and for having me this afternoon. As mentioned, my name is Blane Skiles. I'm the Communications Director at the Deason Criminal Justice Reform Center, which is a research and advocacy center that's based at the SMU Dedman School of Law in Dallas. The Deason Center specializes in 3 main areas. One is public defense and the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. The other is what we call STAR criminal justice, which stands for small, tribal, and rural, and then also prosecutorial discretion. And I'm really excited to talk to you today about taking research and turning it into publications, reports, and content that really has an impact, whether that's policy change or more public awareness, or just building advocacy coalitions. And I'm specifically going to be talking about our philosophy about research and how we go about it at the Deason Center. So just to talk through some of the presentation topics that I'll be talking about and giving you a brief overview, we're going to start with the problems with traditional reports, why we need to improve how we communicate about research. I will walk through 5 best practices for written publications. I'm also going to show you an example tool that you can use in your next publication as you think about how you can communicate more effectively. I'll give you 3 ways to think beyond a written report to bring even more awareness to your research. And I'll also give you some examples of digital and social media strategies that you can use. So let's start by talking about some of the problems with traditional reports. First and foremost, the people who need to read your publication most aren't researchers. They're policymakers, advocates, journalists, impacted community members, people who can really take your research and run with it and create change. But most traditional reports are usually written for researchers. They aren't accessible to average readers because they're too long. They usually consist of mainly long blocks of text. They aren't adapted for digital consumption, meaning they're not easy to read on a phone or a computer screen. And they also don't have a clear call to action. So people don't know what to do with the information that they're given. So let's talk about why this matters. At the Deason Center, we believe wholeheartedly in what we call research for reform. If we work on a publication and just a few people read it and it sits on a shelf and nothing happens, that's not really a good use of our time. And we believe in this so much that we've really adopted a research philosophy where we don't pursue research projects that don't have a clear path to reform opportunities. And a really big part of that is actionable recommendations. Recommendations that come from research need to be actionable, because if people don't know what to do with the information that they receive, they aren't going to do anything at all. And there's a real opportunity for research to lead to better outcomes for people. And if you're not giving people actionable recommendations, they're not going to get there. The other thing is policymakers really need help understanding issues at a basic level. I think a lot of times people forget that policymakers are people too. They're not always subject matter experts. And so you really have to explain issues to them at a level that they can comprehend and understand, and then take it and create policy change from it. I met somebody who worked in governmental affairs for an organization one time, and they described it how I think is perfectly. It's kind of funny, but they said their research team is really focused at understanding things on a macro level, but the governmental affairs team is focused on understanding them at the macaroni and cheese level. And that stuck with me because I think that it's really an accurate way of describing how you sometimes have to present things to policymakers so that they can then turn around and create good policy from it. Another thing that's really important to me and to us at the Deason Center is honoring the communities that you study. You have to make sure that you're not using impacted individuals and communities just to accomplish a research objective. And a really good way to honor the individuals and communities that are involved in your research is to tell their story in a way that connects with people and leads to change for them. And the last thing about why this matters is that you do good work and people should see it. You need to honor your time and effort by producing a finished product that will have more impact. So let's dive into some best practices. And I want to start with how we fix this for written reports. As mentioned in the lovely introduction, I used to be a journalist, so I'm very used to dealing with facts. So I came up with this mnemonic device to break down 5 best practices for written reports. It's FACTS. The F stands for fewer words. You should always consider when you're writing whether or not you can say the same thing with less. The economy of words is another way of putting it. You should examine every sentence and paragraph. Think if you can say the same thing with fewer words, communicate your message and get it across more efficiently. A really good way of achieving this is by using active voice. Active voice makes your writing more clear and concise automatically, so it will lead to fewer words, but it also makes your work more engaging to read and helps people connect more on a more personal and emotional level. The C in this mnemonic device stands for compelling visuals. I think that you cannot invest enough time or resources in compelling data visuals because most people cannot look at a bunch of tables and understand what data means. Researchers are more accustomed to doing that and are they're able to do that a lot more effectively. Most people can't. Most people see a pivot table and their eyes glaze over. So you should invest in compelling data visuals and provide visuals that people can understand by just looking at it for a few seconds. The T is thoughtful tone. Being conversational is really important. Knowing who your audience is, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, but knowing who your audience is and talking directly to them will really help drive your research along and help people connect the dots more effectively. And the S, the last one, is shorter sentences. You have to give people time to take a breath and absorb the information that you're giving them. And ending a sentence is a really good way of doing that. You should be breaking your complex sentences down into multiple shorter ones. And I always say that if you have a sentence that has lots of commas or em dashes or semicolons, that's a really good red flag where you need to stop and think, can I break this sentence up into some shorter sentences? So knowing these 5 best practices, fewer words, active voice, compelling visuals, thoughtful tone, shorter sentences, I want to take a second and do a quick poll of the audience. I would love to know which one of these strategies you think is going to be the most difficult for you to implement. Is it fewer words, active voice, compelling visuals, thoughtful tone, or shorter sentences? The poll is launching right now, so we're just going to take a second. If everyone can respond and let me know, I would love to know if there's one overwhelming thing that's going to be the most difficult for everyone who is on the call. And it's looking like already compelling visuals is leading the way. And I know that that one can be really tough. You might be used to dealing with a lot of stats in your research and thinking about ways that you can make that more compelling and more visual, I think is a challenge for anybody. So we got compelling visuals at 44%. Fewer words, 21% comes in second place. I think fewer words has a little bit more of a direct path to getting there, right? Especially if you start implementing that active voice. We'll talk through some stuff about compelling visuals in a little bit to give you some tips on how you can make that happen. One thing I want to touch on though about compelling visuals is going back to what I said about making sure that people understand it if they're just looking at it for a few seconds. That's why actually visualizing data is really important, because it's not just a table, it's not just numbers. They aren't having to look and try to decipher what they're supposed to be learning from this. I think using data visuals is a really good tool for making them more compelling. Speaking of tools, I do want to take a second and walk through a tool that we have developed at the Deason Center for our written reports and publications that really help us nail down how we are going to communicate the information that we're trying to communicate. So we have this form that we've developed, and I think that someone's going to put it in the chat so that y'all can download it and start implementing it today in your organizations or customizing it however you see fit. I'm going to walk through each field on this tool, and then we're going to dive into each of them a little bit more deeply. The first thing we do after just putting our title on there so that we know what research project this is for is we start thinking about our audience. Who exactly is this report? Is this publication? Who is it for? Who do we imagine reading it? And how are we going to develop this publication for that audience? This field here is what we call the elevator pitch. It's a short way of saying what story are we trying to tell? And I'll talk a little bit more about what elements make up a really good elevator pitch. But we call it the elevator pitch because you can imagine if you're on an elevator with somebody and you're going to tell them what your research project is, you want to tell them and get it across to them before the elevator gets to the floor that you're going to. So just something short and concise. We have a 5-step outline process for how we are going to tell that story. So the elevator pitch is what story we're trying to tell. The outline is how we're going to tell it. And then we have some fields down here at the Deason Center. Our brand is stats and stories. So we want to make sure that every research publication that we produce has stats and stories in it. But you could adapt this for your organization on how you go about communicating your research. But this is just your specific tactics for how you're going to connect that story to your audience. So let's dive into these things a little bit more deeply, starting with finding your audience. So again, who exactly is this report, is this publication for? This is really important because I hate to tell you, the general public does not exist. Everyone comes to research and comes to read a publication with their own history, with their own personality. So you really can't just write for the general public, because you're going to end up either over communicating something, under communicating something. You really need to nail down who your audience is, and you need to be as specific as possible. You should imagine who you want reading your report and write it for them. Some things to consider when you're thinking about your audience is demographics. Is there a specific age range that you imagine your report being read by? What does your audience already know about the topic? What background are they in? What community are they a part of? Another thing to consider is their education level. What levels of education do you want your report to be accessible to? Prior knowledge. Again, do they already know some terms and concepts that are related to the topic? For example, do you need to explain key legal principles, landmark rulings or cases, system processes? What do you need to really explain to your audience to get them to understand what it is you're trying to communicate? And what things do they already know that you need to spend less time communicating about? So these are some things to consider when it comes to finding your audience. The next thing on the form is developing your elevator pitch. Again, what story are you trying to tell? I want to point out here that on this form, the elevator pitch section is like 5 lines long. There is not a lot of room to put an elevator pitch. And that's because it really should only be 2 to 3 sentences. We designed it specifically to where you can't go on and on about an elevator pitch. It has to be something short and concise. There's not a lot of space for it. Another thing that we think about is, explaining it to like what we call like a drunk at a bar, or even your drunk uncle at Thanksgiving or at a family holiday. If you see a distant relative who knows nothing about your work, how will you explain it in 2 to 3 sentences to where they can understand it and they can really grasp what it is you're trying to say? So that's the elevator pitch. The next thing is your outline. Again, how are you going to tell the story? I wanted to repeat myself one more time. Your elevator pitch is what story you're trying to tell. Your outline is how you're going to tell it. On the form, there are 5 steps from beginning to end. I do want to point out that you could take fewer than 5 steps in your outline if you wanted to. However, I think that it should at least be 3. Because you do need a beginning, middle, and an end when you're thinking about a publication or a report. So I would say anywhere from 3 to 5 steps, but definitely no more than 5. Your outline should connect to your elevator pitch. So if your elevator pitch is 3 sentences long, your outline, your 5 steps should connect to those 3 sentences, exactly how you're going to tell that story that you summarized in that elevator pitch. If you're struggling to outline your publication in 5 steps, it probably is more than 1 report. It may be 2, it may be 3 publications. But for people's attention spans and for them to really grasp your message that you're trying to say in 1 publication, you should be able to outline it in 5 steps. This may be a difficult concept to grasp, so I do want to walk through an example of a report that we did at the Deason Center. It's called Getting Gideon Right, and it is all about eligibility standards for appointed counsel in Texas misdemeanor cases. So how courts determine who is too poor to afford their own lawyer and who needs to get one appointed to them by the courts. So our 5-step outline for this publication, step 1 was that we spent a good amount of time explaining what the 6th Amendment is, what it promises, what the Gideon versus Wainwright court decision did. And then we were able to dive into how Texas counties set their own standards of indigence. So Texas is a state where there is no statewide indigence standard. Each county is able to set their own standard. Then we talked about how those indigent standards are unfair, how the federal poverty line, for example, is not a good method of determining poverty, how the standards are different between counties because Texas is a state where each county can set their own. So you have these disparities in indigent standards. We spent step 3 talking specifically about unfairness. Step 4 was talking about some better methods to determine indigence, better methods than the federal poverty line, for example, some other tools that courts could use to determine poverty and indigence. And then step 5 was our policy recommendations. So what specific actionable recommendations policymakers could do to make this more fair for people and to make the system operate more effectively. So that may seem like a lot. I mean, you can fit a lot in 5 steps, but again, there are a lot of things that we could have included in this report that we didn't. We could have gone into qualifications for appointed attorneys in Texas, what standards courts use to determine which attorneys are eligible to serve as appointed counsel. We could have gone into how much counties pay for indigent defense and how that differs from county to county. We could have gone into which counties reimburse attorneys for their travel expenses. And I give all of these examples because all of these are examples of things that we did and initially want to include in this report. However, when we went through this 5-step outline process, we realized that all of those things were better for other reports, not this one, because again, I think telling your story in 5 steps is really important for people to be able to understand it. So the last thing that I want to dive into on this tool is specific tactics. Again, this is how you're going to guide your audience through the story. So your elevator pitch is the story that you want to tell. The outline is how you're going to do it. The specific tactics are how you're going to guide your audience and get them there. This is a really good opportunity for you to connect again back to that audience that you decided who this report is for. Try to think about what is going to help them connect to that story that you're trying to tell and how you're going to get there. So a really important part of that is keeping your audience in mind. Using the stats and stories approach that we use at the Deason Center, we think about what findings from the data analysis are going to help tell that story. What specific research do we have that helps illustrate that story that we're trying to tell. And then the stories side are the real life examples, which I think, again, your organization may not take that stats and stories approach like the Deason Center does, but I certainly think that you should not overlook the importance of real life examples and stories from actual people. There's a saying in the news industry that people love people stories, and that's why those feature stories are so popular, and that's why reporters spend a lot of time and effort on finding emotional stories that people can connect to. That's just how we are wired as humans. And I think the more that you can incorporate real stories from real people in your research and in your publications, the better off that you're going to be. One note about specific tactics that I do want to include in here is that you should only include things that relate to your outline. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a bunch of superfluous stuff in there that's kind of disconnected. You might have a really, really great story that you want to put in there, but if it doesn't relate to that 5-step outline that you developed, then you should probably consider leaving it out and figuring out another way to feature that story outside of your publication. You could also think about including that extra stuff in an appendix, in a separate report, but in the publication itself, you should really only be including things that relate to your outline. So I want to move on to thinking beyond the written report. So up until this point, I've been talking about written reports, but there are so many other opportunities for you to get your research message across and to elevate your findings in your research that are more than just a written report. The 3 that I want to touch on are digital media, translating your written report into interactive digital content, social media, using social media to promote your work and grow your audience, and then also earned media, raising awareness through press placements. Digital media, I'll run through really quickly. This is an example of that same report that we did in Getting Gideon Right, and I just want to show you quickly how we turned that into a web page that has our recommendations on it, our actionable recommendations that policymakers can use. We put some of our data visuals on the website as well that people could scroll through. This is another example of taking those statistics and those facts and turning them into things that are a little bit more immersive and a little bit more compelling. So this is what I mean when I talk about digital media. There are many, many opportunities for you to take a research report and to turn it into something that is more suited for digital consumption. I have some other examples in here of an interactive map, a campaign landing site, and some immersive storytelling. However, in the interest of time, I will leave these links for you to explore in the PDF version of the slides that are going to come out to you. You'll be able to explore these on your own because I don't have time to dive into all three of them right now, but they will be there for you. You should be able to just click on them and explore them on your own. So touching on social media really quickly, social media is not easy. I think a lot of people think that it is. Maybe you're not one of those people, but a lot of people think social media is easy and that interns do it. And but I'm here to tell you that it's not, but it is a really valuable tool. It's a valuable tool because your audience is already there, and it's a really easy way for you to meet your audience where they are. It's a really great activation tool for you to engage with specific communities about your research and to build unique coalitions that can advocate for those actionable recommendations that you develop through your research. I think a really easy way to think about social media as an activation tool is to think about it in terms of pressuring policymakers with public calls for change. A good thing about developing a really good outline and an elevator pitch early on in your process is that you can easily turn that outline and elevator pitch into social media content. I think that your outline, your 5-step outline, is kind of a built-in Twitter thread almost of 5 tweets, beginning, middle, end of your research publication. You can also, develop some visual content and turn that into Instagram carousels based off of your outline or your elevator pitch. One word of warning, oh, there it is, Twitter threads and Instagram carousels. One word of warning about social media is that you should use simple overviews only. Do not get too complicated or too in the weeds when you're turning your research into social media content. And I will also warn you, don't post for other researchers because it's really better to build an audience and to communicate your research to that audience that you thought about when you were writing your publication and doing your research. It's better to build that audience than to build clout with other researchers. I think a lot of times the content that I see on social media about research is just like the reports written for other researchers. So just a little tip there. And then I also say that social media is a great tool for pushing from those simple overviews to the full report for more information. But that means you should make your research or your publication easy to find, whether that's putting the link in social media or featuring it prominently on a website somewhere. It needs to be discoverable and easy to find. Let's do a quick audience poll about social media. I would love to know which social media platforms, if any, you're already using to promote your research. I have some options here: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, other, or maybe you're not using social media at all. I would love to see the responses here. It looks like a lot of people aren't using social media at all yet. Again, it's not easy. It's especially not easy to get started because it can feel like you are posting into the abyss and nobody's reading it because you don't have an audience yet. But it really is a great tool for connecting with people because, again, they're already there, they're already using it. I would say especially the more popular platforms like the ones that are listed here. So it looks like 68% aren't using social media at all. And the ones that are mainly using Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, which is no surprise to me. I have some examples in here. I'm going to blow through them quickly in the interest of time of how we at the Deason Center have used social media to create some visual content. This is just an example of something that we did on the anniversary of the Gideon v. Wainwright decision last year. to explain to our social media audience who may not be as aware of that landmark Supreme Court decision when it comes to public defense, about what it is, who Clarence Gideon was. This is a good example of how we turned a research publication with data visuals into an Instagram carousel. And this is an example from a report that we did about racial disparity in marijuana cases in Dallas County. So we were able to use, this is another reason why investing in time and resources into data visuals is important, because it gives you built-in social media content that you can then turn around and post on social media, push to the report for more. This is just, again, very simple, brief overview summaries of our findings. And then we were able to send people to the full report for more information. The last strategy that I want to talk about in terms of moving beyond the written report is earned media. And what I mean by earned media is getting your research covered in the press. So one thing that I would start doing today, if you don't already have one, is start building a list of journalists who are covering the issues that you are involved in research about. So start looking at reporters, editors. If you want to get on TV, you should know booking producers. If you're talking about local TV, it's usually what's called the assistant news director. Start thinking about either what media organizations in your local community or some national or regional organizations who are interested in your topics of interest, and start finding those names and building that list of journalists. I think one easy way of doing that is going to Twitter and just searching for your keywords, or if you have a certain outlet in mind, searching that outlet, and then whoever in their Twitter bio has that outlet or those keywords will pop up. And that's a really easy way for you to start building that list of journalists. Start building that list, but don't end it there. Don't end it with just building the list. Actually email those people whenever news happens that's related to your research. Whenever you feel like you have something to give, if something's going on in the news and you have research that will help illuminate that story or help inform audiences in any way, send them an email and let them know that. Send a news release whenever you publish a new report. Respond to those current events. And the last thing is, don't be afraid to just write an op-ed sometimes. There are local online publications and local newspapers who need content, and they want to hear from experts in the field. So don't be afraid to write an op-ed and send it to them. The worst thing they can do is say no, and then you have an op-ed that's written that you can tweak as more current events happen. So I know that was a lot. I do want to recap really quickly, and then we'll move into Q&A. Stick to the facts, that mnemonic device that I talked about with the 5 best practices for written publications: fewer words, active voice, compelling visuals, thoughtful tone, shorter sentences. Consider your audience. That's really important and often overlooked. The general public does not exist. Develop an elevator pitch and an outline. This will pay dividends later on. You will have built-in social media content. You will be able to focus your publication a lot more effectively. Think beyond those written publications. Don't be afraid to dip your toe into the social media waters, to turn your report into something that's immersive and more tailor-made for digital. And so that's the recap. I'm happy to move into Q&A and answer some questions from the audience and the YJI team.
Great. Thank you so much, Blane. That was an awesome presentation, a lot of things for people to mull over. And as people are mulling them over, please continue to put questions in the Q&A. But something that we have initially to ask you is, do you have any tips about how to change your language for different audiences, perhaps within the same publication, or do you need to have multiple publications for that? This comes out of, we know that different people have different types of training and different language that people are comfortable using. So lawyers speak one language and PhD researchers speak a different language. How do you reconcile those things in the reports that you write and publish?
It's a great question. I think that, first of all, it goes back to knowing who your audience is and really doing the work to nail that down early on. I think that when you mentioned potentially doing different reports or different publications, there's something to that. It may seem like a lot of work, but one thing that we have just recently started doing at the Deason Center is we will write a report, and then we will turn that report into a policy brief that's specifically for the policymakers or the practitioners who have a higher level of understanding of the background issues and kind of the system, so that we spend much less time in a policy brief explaining, like I gave that example about what we did in getting Gideon right and how we explained the Sixth Amendment and the Supreme Court decision and all of that. We spend much less time doing that in the policy brief. They're a little bit less visual and graphic. I mean, we still have great data visuals. We still distill our stats and our all of that research into compelling visuals, but we do it in a little bit less of an illustrated way. So I think that there's something to be said about splitting it up and knowing who your audience is for one thing and who it might be, for another part of that research, another iteration, I guess, of that research. And it may sound overwhelming to create, multiple things, but I think once you do the big report, it's a lot easier to start separating that stuff out. I also think that you can find people within specific communities and audiences to be beta readers. So like maybe you have a community of lawyers and researchers, and you can give it to both of them and say, hey, what do you think about this? Did I balance that correctly? I wouldn't overlook the value of having people read your work beforehand. And then I would also say you really can't go wrong with writing something for someone who is not a practitioner or a researcher. One thing that I think about a lot is how do you write for people and not positions? So thinking about your audience in terms of an actual person who has a certain level of education, or they're coming from a certain community, and thinking about them as people and not, I'm a lawyer, I'm a researcher, because I think that even in those groups, that's really broad, right? There's a lot of diversity within those groups. And so, I think that would be the big takeaway is write for people, not positions.
That's really fascinating, and I'm mulling that over here, and I'm thinking about like the actionable items that you've talked about, and how do you write for action? Thinking about that people, not position, when the positions are the ones who are helping to move those actions along. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that, and let me say, like, we're not perfect. I certainly not always follow all of these, recommendations and tips, but we try. It's a learning process. We try to get better all the time. And I think that going back to what I was saying about how important stories are, and actual stories, and people's real life experiences, and connecting on an emotional level with people goes a really long way. And one thing that I would love to get better at doing is anytime we publish a report or anything that has actionable recommendations in it, that we tie each of those recommendations somewhere in the report to a story or to a person, so that whenever the policymaker, whenever somebody that's in a position to implement reform is looking at those recommendations at the end, they're able to subconsciously connect it back to Julie's story or John's story that they read already. And I think that really plays into that idea of writing for people and not positions, because you're not writing for a US congressperson. You're writing for Blane, who's going to be reading this and connect it to a person's lived experience, and then want to take that recommendation and implement it because they have that emotional connection.
Great, thank you so much. Your presentation today focused a lot on translating statistical data and quantitative research to non-academic audiences. We'd like to know a little bit if you have advice for presenting qualitative research more effectively. For example, if I'm writing a report based on interview data, or something that's more ethnographic, how do you balance that and telling a research story and just a story?
Yeah, I think that data is a lot easier to kind of visualize how you might make it more compelling. I mean, you saw the examples that went through quickly of the maps and the charts and all of that. I think that's a really clear thing. Qualitative data can be a little bit trickier, but there is certainly opportunities for creativity. I think about narrative storytelling or immersive storytelling is one thing that comes to mind. Taking your qualitative research, and this especially, could translate really well to digital, and creating some sort of digital experience that puts your reader in that position of the I guess informant would be the right way of putting it in ethnographic terms. So that's one thing. I would not underestimate the power of a good pull quote, right? I think that's one thing that is so easy but often underused, especially when you think about what my boss would call like the picture book method of somebody thumbing through a report and only looking at the pictures or only looking at the graphics or the tables or the data or the visuals. One thing that they would stop and pause on is a pull quote. So don't overlook the impact of those. And then I think that another thing that you could do with qualitative research is thinking about it in terms of this person moving through a particular system or a particular part of the system and taking their story or what they told you in their interview and visualizing them moving through that process, either with icons or pictures, something that's a little bit more visual and a little bit easier for somebody to connect to, instead of just a big block of text.
Great, thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think you answered the question. Thank you. There are a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to ask one of them. So we have somebody who asks, we are a smaller agency that doesn't really do research, but are a nonprofit with a mission and trying to get the word out. Are there adaptations of the strategies you listed that you'd recommend, or do you think they're pretty similar?
I think they're pretty similar. I would say that you could easily take your mission, what it is you're trying to accomplish in the world, and use a lot of these principles, even if you're not publishing really in-depth research publications, whether that be through like individual fact sheets that you're putting together about whatever system you're involved in or whatever you're advocating for, putting together smaller bite-sized things for people to consume that will help just inform a broader audience about what your issue is or what it is that you're advocating for. Certainly the stuff about moving beyond the written report and the social media and the earned media and stuff definitely applies. I mean, there are, it takes time and it takes effort, and it's certainly something that we're still working on and always trying to refine at the Deason Center. If you go to our social media accounts, you aren't going to find tens of thousands of followers. But social media is a really good tool, especially for nonprofits, to start building community, to start building those advocacy coalitions of people who are passionate about what cause or issue that you're focused on. Start tapping into that and start letting them know what's going on, informing them about certain facts that that's going, that are happening in the world. And then also finding research that is out there. If you're not doing your own research, finding research that is out there and then working with those researchers to figure out how you can better communicate their work and their findings. I think that that's something that might be a good path forward for a nonprofit like yours, to start working with researchers and then taking some of these tips to them and saying, hey, can we work together on putting together these social media graphics or some sort of report or a PDF or something that helps me communicate your findings better to my audience.
Awesome. We have another question of kind of on this topic of that partnership. Do you know of good visualization tools? Are there any publications on this topic that you can recommend?
I wish I was well read enough to recommend publications, but I don't know any off the top of my head. I would say there are some good visualization tools out there. For the most beginner level among us, I would recommend Canva, Canva. I don't know if y'all have ever heard of that, but it is a good, very intuitive. It's online based, it's cloud based, so you don't have to download any software. There are tons of tutorials on YouTube for it. And you can do some really, really good basic stuff in Canva that's visually appealing. There's also a lot of templates that you can use that will help you get started. There's a free version, and then if you want to move up to, and this is not sponsored in any way, but if you want to move up to be able to have access to certain other templates or graphics and things like that, you can pay. I think it's like $12 a month. I don't know for sure, for a pro account, but it's really turnkey. You can do some data visuals in it. You can do bar graphs, pie charts, line graphs, things like that. So basic data visuals are included. It's really good for developing presentations. It's good for social media graphics, things like that. If you're a little bit more advanced in data visuals, there's a platform called Flourish, Flourish. My spelling bee, Flourish, just like you would normally spell it. And I think that's from Google, but I don't know for sure. But that is a good data visualization tool that you can use. And I say a little bit more advanced. I'm sure that you could teach yourself relatively quickly. Another tool that I recommend a lot, especially if you're thinking about graphing or cartography, mapping, any sort of geospatial, is Tableau. I mean, you can use Tableau for other data visuals too, but Tableau is really good for creating quick maps. If you click on the link to the map that I had in the slide that I had to skip over for time because I was talking too much, that is an example of how we created something in Tableau. So Flourish, Tableau, Canva, those are three that come to mind for visualization tools.
Awesome. And thank you to our audience members for chiming in here with some recommendations and some links and some additional knowledge. The next question we had was, what are some suggestions for balancing research for reform while maintaining the researcher's objectivity and credibility?
Yes, I know that this is such a consideration for organizations that aren't involved in like advocacy like the Deason Center is. And I would say that a lot of what I talked about today, admittedly, is for moving that research and directing it to advocacy. A lot of you are probably in positions where you may not be able to give like specific recommendations to policymakers. You're just presenting the research, right? And then people can do what they want with it. And I would say then you really need to lean into the best practices that I talked about in terms of communicating effectively, using fewer words, using active voice, turning your pivot tables into compelling visuals, because you aren't able to specifically say, here's my research and here's what you should do with it, right? You're just saying, here's my research. So you really have to do a lot of the work in terms of making that research easy to get across. I also think that you can, I wouldn't say bend the rules, but whenever you're talking about compelling visuals, whenever I say that somebody should get it in a few seconds, there's some leeway that you have in determining what it is you want them to get in that few seconds. And I don't know enough about being an objective researcher to know whether or not that's going to make people uncomfortable. But I do think that you could take a big data set and you're presenting the findings from that data set, and then in how you visualize it and how you communicate it and what it is you want to get across, whether that's with color, red means bad, green means good. There are ways that you can communicate it visually that isn't necessarily going to compromise your objectivity as much as it would be if you said, here's what you should do with this information, but you're able to kind of push the envelope a little bit in how you communicate that data. Does that answer? I hope that answers the question. I mean, that's a hard one for me because I'm so involved in that advocacy piece of it.
Yeah, it probably goes back to your earlier comments about the audience and understanding who you're writing for and like how it's going to be received there.
Yeah.
I have a blend of a couple of questions that I want to ask with looking at the time here. So the questions are about writing strong executive summaries. Should it be called an executive summary? And then there's also a question about AI and ChatGPT and how those things kind of relate to report writing. So thinking of like that summary element and something that AI could be useful for. Curious to hear what thoughts or comments you might have on how both of those things could relate to one another, any challenges that are posed with new tech.
Yeah. In terms of the executive summary part of it, I don't have a problem personally with the term executive summary. I think you could also think about it in terms of just like a fact sheet or one thing that I love to do is to pull out the executive summary from the entire publication and feature that in a different way digitally. So if somebody just wants to read the executive summary and they're overwhelmed when they click on a PDF and it's 40 pages long or 100 pages long, separate that out into a separate PDF so that somebody has the option to just read the executive summary. Now, the caveat is then you better make sure that your executive summary is written in a way to where they're going to be able to connect those dots and get from beginning, middle to end. All 5 steps of your outline need to be in there. Your recommendations need to be in there, and it needs to be presented in a way that's still really concise and really sharp. But I'm not scared of executive summaries at all. I think they're very useful. And I think that's such a term, it's such an ingrained term that people know what they're getting with an executive summary. But if you feel like executive summary isn't the right term for your organization, maybe think about it in terms of a fact sheet or a digest or something like that. AI. I'm really glad that this question came up because I was just talking with my family here that I'm staying with about AI and how who knows if I'm going to have a job one day, right? Because I mean, AI is going to be able to take this, your research and our research and figure out the best way to communicate it. I do think that there is something to be said for that human touch and that human relationship and knowing how people connect with certain things. But AI can certainly, ChatGPT can certainly be useful for you in developing better ways of summarizing. I mean, I certainly think that you could put something into ChatGPT, and I haven't played around with it enough to know, but I certainly think that there are opportunities for you to put long chunks of your work into ChatGPT and get it to give you a good summary. And maybe that's just, you use that as a starting point for an executive summary or for some sort of web copy that you want to develop. I'm sure it could write social media posts for you. And I would say that it's probably really useful to use as a starting point. I personally would obviously just use it as a starting point and then refine from there, because nobody's going to know your research better than you, right? So even maybe even 5 or 10 years the AI will be developed enough to know your research better than you. But I think that it can definitely be a good tool, especially when it comes to summaries and boiling things down into more bite-sized chunks of information.
Yeah, that may be helpful with some of the questions that we had about like active voice and how do you really work towards making sure that your sentences are shorter, making sure you have active voice. I think we have time for this one final question. So I'm going to ask, are there any specific data visualizations that you think are more powerful than others to getting your story across, or is it really independent, like depends on every different circumstance?
I think it depends for sure. You know, yeah, it's so dependent. I mean, it's dependent enough to where, like, if you're talking about wanting to visualize disparity between two different communities, you know, I would recommend a different way of doing that than I would if you were visualizing disparity between geography. You know, like I was talking about with for example, how the Texas counties do indigent standards. There are, you know, different ways of visualizing incarceration rates than arrest rates, right? I think it really depends on what it is. You know, and I think that you know, one thing that I would recommend is just read as much as you can or consume as much content as you can from other people in your field that are doing data visuals, and see what it is they're doing and what you like and don't like about it. And then you can take the best pieces of that, develop kind of your own strategy. But I certainly think that it depends. I think I would say this: a compelling data visual that may not be the best way is way better than no data visual at all. So I wouldn't get too hung up on what's the best data visual, especially if you're just getting started with turning a table of numbers into something that's a little bit more compelling.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Blane, on behalf of the YJI and everybody in attendance today for taking your time to share this important information with us. But before I get to closing announcements, I'm going to pass it back to you for your last final thoughts and takeaways.
Yes, everyone, thank you all so much for just paying attention and taking the time. I'm so honored to be here. I was so honored when the YJI asked me to present this. I don't get to talk about, I love talking about this and I don't get to do it enough. So I just want to applaud YJI for putting this on and for prioritizing how to translate your research. I do want to acknowledge a few things. The first being that implementation of these things is not going to happen overnight. It takes time and effort. My whole job is doing this, and you may work in an organization where you don't have somebody whose job is doing this. But I would challenge you to pick one thing from this presentation and try it for your next publication. Just pick one thing and try to improve on it, whether that's using active voice more or using those shorter sentences, developing an elevator pitch or a 5-step outline. Don't try to take all of this and implement it right now because it is overwhelming and it is hard. I also want to acknowledge that this is difficult. But it's worth it. It's worth it to you. It's worth it to your work. It's worth it to the people who are impacted by the issues that you focus on. And it's definitely worth it if your research can result in policy change and making the system more fair for the people that are impacted by it. So again, thank you all so much. I hope this was useful to you. And thank you for your time. And thank you to everyone at YJI for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, so shifting into our closing announcements, we want to launch a poll to ask everybody how you felt about today's webinar. The poll questions are how much you agree or disagree with the following statements. The webinar was informative. The webinar was engaging. Please answer these questions to the best of your ability so we know how today's webinar went. While everyone is answering the question, I have a few announcements and items to put on everyone's radar. The next YJI Lunch and Learn webinar session will be held on Tuesday, June 27th at 12 p.m. Eastern with Dr. Vanessa Panfil, a professor at Old Dominion University. She will be presenting LGBTQ+ Youth Justice Now, the urgency of reducing criminalization and improving well-being. The link to register will be distributed to our mailing list soon. And save the date, Curry Cook from Lambda Legal will be continuing the conversation on the impact of legislation on LGBTQ+ youth on Tuesday, September 26th. Immediately following this webinar, We will be sending a survey link to you all via email. If you have the time, please do complete the survey as it allows you to provide further feedback and questions for us. This information is also used to improve future webinar sessions. The survey should take no longer than 5 minutes, and we will also be putting the link in the survey in chat now. Finally, if you've not already done so, feel free to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. The links to those accounts can be found on our website. Just a quick reminder, the views expressed here are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. In closing, I want to thank you all for taking part in this session of the webinar series. We hope that you've gained something from this webinar and that you continue to think about what Blane has presented today. We look forward to seeing you at future YJI events and webinars.